The state opening ceremony is really a very unusual one and a special one. It marks the start of a parliamentary session, and it's the formality of the Queen opening Parliament, summoning the House of Commons and the House of Lords to hear the programme of legislation for the year, the Queen's speech. Of course, the Queen doesn't write the Queen's speech. It's in fact nowadays the government's agenda. But it is very symbolic of how our constitution works and the fact that for legislation to be passed, it has to have the agreement of the House of Commons, the House of Lords, and of the sovereign, royal assent, for a bill to become legislation. So what happens is that the Queen arrives in great splendour, that she comes into the House of Lords and sits on the throne there, and that the Commons are summoned to attend in the chamber of the House of Lords, and they come in very noisily and stand at the bar of the House beyond where you can speak from in the House of Lords. And there you have the three elements, Queen, Commons and Lords, together in one place to symbolise the start of a parliamentary session. For many people, when they think about the House of Lords, I think the image is of state opening, everyone in those splendid robes and lots of pomp and circumstance, the Queen with her crown on. In fact, of course, it's only one day of the year that the House looks like that. It's very, very different from how it normally is, not least because there are people who aren't members of the House of Lords in there. The senior judges in the country are in for state opening. Many of the diplomatic corps, the people who represent their countries here, are also in the chamber. So it's very different from our normal working environment in the House of Lords, when everyone's in ordinary clothes, when they're doing the line-by-line scrutiny of legislation. We spend over half our time going through bills, discussing amendments, making something like 3,000 amendments to legislation every year. So very, very special occasion. And I think it's always interesting to think about the tradition and the ceremonial that people like to see, but to make sure that that isn't a barrier to understanding the normal work of a serious legislative chamber, which is what the House of Lords is. So the state opening really is the parliamentary new year in many ways. It's when the Queen outlines in that speech from the throne what the programme of legislation will be. That happens in the morning of the day of state opening. In the afternoon, we have a fairly formal session starting to debate the Queen's speech. But after that, we go into probably 5 days of debate, taking the various sectors of the most interest, whether it's health and social services, it's education and the environment, foreign affairs. So we'll have long debates about the generality of government policy and the legislation that's being proposed. Then after that, the timetable moves on. We start seeing bills being introduced for their first general debates that then move through to have their committee stages when they're scrutinised, their report stage, and finally third reading, and then royal assent, the imprimatur of the Queen saying that this legislation has reached the statute book. So the day of state opening is marked with ceremonial, with hundreds of years of tradition, and quite a lot of pomp and circumstance. But for parliamentarians, it actually marks the start of a serious, long programme of work to turn what is outlined in the Queen's speech into legislation that will affect every citizen in the country.